All right, here we are. The first official coronavirus slash pandemic slash open revolt slash race protest slash what are we missing? Zombie apocalypse? I mean, if you have what my dear friend Allegra is referring to as your batshit bingo card, that's what she's calling it, 2020, your batshit bingo card. She's like, who called cannibalism? Evidently, there was a story in the news about a 56-year-old cannibal who did away with a few pizza delivery men. I'm not even kidding. I don't have the story in front of me, but you can Google it because it showed up. So here we are. It is June the 10th. It is 2 days before a surgery that I have waited almost 6 years to do. So I'm pretty excited about that. And today is the 78th day that I've been going live on Facebook at 3:30, because a week into coming home, I came home. Let me just give you a little pandemic background. Let's refresh, okay? So in January, I did a podcast called Hindsight is So 2020. And I'm super grateful that we posted it to my YouTube channel, and you guys have very much embraced it. It's gotten a lot of views. Segment 1 at last look had almost 5,000 views. I'm super grateful. And what was amazing about Hindsight is So 2020 is that I didn't know in January what we were staring down the barrel of. And yet, if you listen to it, you would have thought that I knew. Forgiveness, like charity, begins at home. So let's forgive everything from the last 2 decades. Heck, from however many decades you've been alive. We are starting the 3rd decade. I had this thought and I jotted it down. I write, the experience was the payoff. Meaning, when you're looking for something to pay off, when you have an expectation, the experience, the occurrence, the fact that you were on the right side of the dirt and something happened is the payoff. Good, bad, or indifferent, something happened. You decide if you're in the red or the black. It's a decision. You would have thought that I knew, but I didn't. But it's because there's just some universal truths. There's just some things. And being 20 years into a new millennium, here we thought like, hey, it's a new decade. It's 2020, New Year's Eve, ball drops. We had all that montage of Barbara Walters saying, this is 2020. We had such high hopes that 2020 was going to be a game changer. It's an election year. Like, we knew it was going to be something, and the Gen Zers and millennials, like if you were born in 1999, you're turning 21 this year. Like, so much. Who knew? Hindsight is So 2020 was in January. And then right before I caught a plane for Australia, and that one is posted on the site as well, or will be. But by the time you're hearing this, it'll be on YouTube. And that one's called I Love It When a Plan Comes Together. And that was 48 hours before I landed in New Zealand as the world was shutting down. Now, I had booked 6 weeks, a 6-week tour. And I'm going to tell you a little something, boys and girls. If you know me by now, or if you're brand new to the Monique world, I jokingly refer to myself as a bruja, witch in Spanish. I have intuition. I vibe on things. I hear voices. I don't care if you think I'm bananas. It worked for Joan of Arc. And I've already lived later than 19, so I'm good. So let me just explain how that works. The way my intuition works is that I feel things. I get vibes. Like when you're talking to me, I'll get like a notion, like follow that thread. That's important. Don't lose that. Pay attention. Like a plot point, like you're watching a movie. When people talk to me, I feel what they're saying. I don't so much listen to the words as feel. That's why I always tell people that's the reason why the word ear is in the middle of heart. Pay attention in a whole different way when people are speaking to you. It's not a magic trick. Everybody, I believe, is intuitive. It's just like working out at the gym, though. The more you use it, the stronger your intuition gets. And I very much rely on my intuition. I believe in it. I trust it. I use it. So the other way my intuition works is that I get like snapshots, images, like somebody just threw a Polaroid down for a second. And, when I originally signed to go to Australia, New Zealand, and French Polynesia, I was like, I'm going to go to these amazing places. And I'm excited about it, but I was extremely nervous about being gone for 6 weeks. It's the longest I've ever been gone as a comedian. I went to Korea in the 90s for almost a full month, and that was difficult. But I was in a lousy marriage, and I knew my dog was cared for by said ex-husband. So being gone a month in the 90s before FaceTime, and when you would have to go to the PX and buy a phone card, and had X amount of minutes, and then you'd go to, they had these phone rooms on the military bases, and then you would go in, you would wait your turn for a phone, and you would go in, and there'd just be a bunch of guys like they were, when people are in prison and they sit in the little cubby, there'd just be guys lying in all different forms of repose in these cubbies, and some of the little snippets of conversation you would overhear, you'd be like, oh, I didn't need to hear that. There was no privacy. You were just in the phone room with your phone card talking to your gal or your guy. And that's what I did. But now I was thinking, okay, what's the worst thing about being gone for 6 weeks? Is that the time change. Mind blown since I started being a comedian of how much more convenient it is to be on the road. How things just kind of are truly global. And that when I started comedy and I was a road comic, I would be listening to the radio in Houston. And once you drove past a certain part between Houston and San Antonio, you got a little bit of signal. You get some random music. But once you got out past Van Horn, between Van Horn and El Paso, is what I would call the Texas roll. You would hit scan and your radio just goes, and never hits on a station. You would have the Texas roll between Van Horn and El Paso, and that was that, in certain parts of the middle of the country. But now with Sirius XM, you can hear there's continuity of message. And I'm talking about continuity of message, not just in the literal, but in the metaphoric, meaning is that things are not regional. Radio stations have completely changed the way they do business, and that there's a lot of stations that you hear in your little hometown in the middle of BFE that are not hometown, that are all coming out of a centralized program to save money. There's some good news and some bad news in that, localized is expensive. But on the other hand, there was something to be said for having a very specific radio show geared towards, your town, Victoria, Texas, or, Shreveport, Louisiana. And some of those towns still have their own people and their own, jocks. But it's amazing to me how different message is now. And not just radio, and not just television, and not just picking up the phone, and not just FaceTime, and not just WhatsApp or Zoom or WebEx. All of these things are just going faster, 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 faster. Global, faster, everyone. It's crazy. So March 6th, I did a podcast called I Love It When a Plan Comes Together. And I prepared to get on a plane, and I was going to fly for 12 or 13 hours to Auckland. And then from Auckland, I was going to jump over to a little town called Dunedin in New Zealand, on the other side of the world. And I was going to lose a day, which is so peculiar when you fly internationally that you lose a day and gain a day. Like I left Australia the morning of March 17th. I flew for a whole day and I landed earlier in the morning of March 17th. I lived St. Patrick's Day twice. I lived it on an airplane and I lived it in LA, and I had weird jet lag. So I fly to New Zealand, and in the time that I'm in the air, I knew that things were weird when I got to LAX because not very many people were flying. There were a lot of empty seats. It was actually very comfortable flying to New Zealand because I had space, and people were already wearing masks. We were already hearing about Wuhan and coronavirus. I mean, it was a story. It was happening. It hadn't been declared a pandemic by the World Health Organization. The NBA hadn't stopped its season, but it was big news. It was big news in that before I even left, I was supposed to fly to New Caledonia and to a place called Noumea. And those small islands on the other side of the world were no longer accepting travelers. So here I am, early March, thinking about this 6-week tour. And I'm going to circle back to talking about being intuitive. I never saw me being gone for 6 weeks. I couldn't picture certain things that I knew were on my itinerary, but I couldn't picture that they were going to happen. And to take it to another level, a girlfriend of mine was going to join me, because one of the perks of working on cruise ships is that people can join me free of charge. They can share my cabin. And we were so excitedly talking about the trip before COVID. And then she got nervous, but she's like, you know what? I'll risk it. And if we get stuck together in New Zealand, we get stuck. Well, within a week of March 6th, and a few days of me being on the ship, I got the email that all guests were canceled. By the time I hit the second port in New Zealand, the middle of that following week, the World Health Organization had declared it a pandemic. My last live performance on a stage in front of an audience was March 13th. 1 week later, March 13th, 2020, was my last live performance on a stage in front of an audience. I disembarked Saturday, March 14th, March 14th in Sydney, Australia. And in Sydney, people were still pretty normal. You were seeing some masks. But the 3 days that I was in Sydney, that they weren't sure what they were going to do with me or where they were going to put me. And again, it's such a crazy world that I could just pick up my phone. I'm on the other side of the world and my T-Mobile works. And I'm calling Los Angeles and I'm hearing that no Lakers games. And it's so weird to be isolated and hearing different communiques from different parts of the world. I'm watching Australian news. I'm calling friends in LA. Friends of mine from New York are posting stuff on Facebook. Like the whole world, just changed in the week I was on that ship dramatically. And that there's even people that live on ships. Some of the nicer ships, older folks, they're mostly older. I haven't met any younger ones, say, hey, you know what? To have, live-in maid service, food 3 times a day. Some of these ships have full mini hospitals. I'm a person of a certain age. I'm a person of means. I'm going to live out my years. I'm going to keep a small apartment and I'm going to live on a ship. Well, by the time I got to Sydney, they had not only said nobody's getting back on any ship, but the Queen Mary had also, I think it's the Queen Mary, had also, or maybe Queen Mary 2, because the Queen Mary's in Long Beach. Basically, all of the cruise ships had told the people who live on them, you're going to have to figure something out. We're shutting down. So imagine, in effect, these people are getting evicted from what they think is going to be their floating home. So by the time I got to the airport, March 17th, which my agent called me at 3 a.m. New Zealand time, Australia time, to say, get to the airport. I was on the last flight. And some of you have heard this story on my Facebook 330s, but it bears repeating. The flight I took went from Sydney to Brisbane. There were no direct flights anymore from Sydney to New York or Sydney to LAX. So it was Sydney to Brisbane to LAX. The flight was packed. There was not one seat because all of these people that had been displaced from cruise ships had to get home or get to the States or get to their kids' houses. So it was extremely peculiar. And in the time that I've been home, it's 11 weeks at this point. 11 weeks. I committed to doing 40 live shows at 3:30 on Facebook. 40. Because to me it was biblical. It was sort of like we were in an invisible flood. We were confined like being on Noah's Ark. 40. And the 40th show was Sunday, May the 3rd. And what's very peculiar to me is how long ago landing seems and how much has happened in those 11 weeks and how different the world is in so many ways. In so many ways. We cannot go back We cannot unring the bell of knowledge. We will never be the same. When I recorded I Love It When a Plan Comes Together, I was a different girl. And I'm going to call this podcast specifically Crossing the Rubicon. Because what crossing the Rubicon means, it's an expression that was first coined to describe Julius Caesar. Because there's a river that when you cross it in one direction in Italy, you can't go back the other way. It was a river he crossed, I believe. I'm talking off the top of my head. But I believe it was a river he crossed on his way to Rome. But that being said, with me talking off the top of my head and not looking at notes, the expression crossing the Rubicon means you cannot go back. That's it. Bridge burnt, scorched earth, nothing behind you. It's the gumball rally, he gets in the car, grabs the mirror, rips it, throws it over his shoulder. The first rule of Italian driving, what is behind you does not matter.
And now, my friend, the first rule of Italian driving. What's behind me is not important.
We are different people. I haven't even gotten to the other stuff. I'm still talking COVID. There's so much more. But what I want to talk about crossing the Rubicon is that we are different as a society. This lockdown, this pause for the cause, this regroup, this forced whatever it is that was not forced by society or politics or aliens, it just was. It was an enormous global social agreement that we all made almost simultaneously, that we were going to behave in a specific way for the good of the world. At some point in the, 11 weeks ago, 11 and change, and it's amazing to me to think how different the world is in 3 months. 3 months. We have made global, unspoken agreements to do things as a species. Flights have been shut down. Countries were closed. Masks were mailed and not mailed. Tests were used and not used. Some things worked, some things didn't. Evidently, the Fed just started printing money, because I don't know where all this money came from that all of a sudden landed in people's, who knew? All I can say is, trillions of dollars? From where? Shrug. And we're doing away with, free hot lunches for children at risk. And yet, we can come up with, bailouts. It's a head scratcher for me. But we have crossed the Rubicon. And I want you to think about speed at which we've crossed it now. And how we are irretrievably on the other side. No different than we could never go back to buying phone cards and talking on a rotary phone connected to a wall. It's all different now. That is the first segment of Crossing the Rubicon, my first post-pandemic podcast. This is the Monique Marvez Show.